Hi, and welcome to Christ Church Daily. So today's reflection is carrying on with the book of Philippians. We're in chapter 4. Paul says this. He says, "I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I learned to be content whatever the circumstances." So if you remember from yesterday, the Philippian church had just provided Paul with some financial aid and some food, probably. And he's thanked them for it, but then he says this. So he says, "I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who strengthens me." And this morning when I got up and I was praying about this, and I was just struggling actually to write something about contentment, because it's something that I really struggle with. And I'm quite a restless person. I'm always looking for the next thing. I get really easily agitated by stuff when it doesn't go to plan, when things go wrong. And I get frustrated when life isn't exactly how I want it to be. But Paul's words just really touched me this morning, that there is a really deep desire in me to be able to be content, whatever the circumstance, whatever is going on in the world and in my own life and my own emotions. So for many of us in this moment, life is probably not how we want it to be. I'm really thankful for the sunshine again today, but I can't help but think about what's going to happen when the weather turns, which I think it's going to do next week, and how that will impact us again with the reality of lockdown and not being able to see our friends and our family, and trying to entertain children, and all the frustrations and the kind of grief that entails. And I think for many of us, actually, this is the first time in our lives, definitely the first time in my life, when some of the daily provisions that I've always taken for granted, so well-stocked supermarket shelves, the use of public transport, the freedom to go where I want, when I want, those provisions are being taken away. And it's pretty uncomfortable. It's a jolt to the system to go to the supermarket and for something that you've always been able to get, and then to look at the shelves and for it not to be there, and to kind of realize that the nation's supplies of pasta, hand wash, toilet paper have just vanished. And our situation pales in comparison to much of the world. So I want to be careful not to kind of be too self-pitying today, because I saw a little meme on Facebook last week, which my friend had posted, and it was sort of like these little picture postcards addressed from nations in the world to the rest of the world, highlighting really the complacency of much of the Western world to the struggles of so many other countries. So, for example, one of them said, "Dear world, how is the separation from your loved ones from Syria?" And another one said, "Dear world, how is the lockdown from Palestine?" And another one, "Dear world, how is the stockpiling from Yemen?" And the reality is that for those of us living in the UK, even those of us living in quite difficult circumstances, we don't really know suffering. Very few of us have experienced anything like what's happening now before. And what we're experiencing is really so minor in comparison to the rest of the world. And I do think we have a lesson to learn here from Paul and from other people who really do know suffering and who know what it means to experience joy and peace and content in the middle of that. We have a lesson to learn, I think, from people who have experienced circumstances so extreme and uncomfortable that it begs the question of how on earth can you claim to be content in the middle of that, in the midst of hunger and persecution and grief and desperate need. So in the Hebrew language, which is the language that much of the Old Testament, the first half of the Bible, is written in, and it's a language that's kind of that Jewish culture is like entrenched in, there's this word shalom, which many of you have maybe heard of. And in Hebrew, it's a greeting. It means something like peace. And often it's used to say as a way of saying hello or a way of bidding goodbye to someone. But shalom means so much more than that. It means like wholeness or fullness. And it's a kind of way of explaining like an inward state of your soul that transcends the situation that's going on, that's bigger than whatever is happening around you, and this inward kind of state of peace and stability that is not knocked or destabilized by the world. So in his prison cell, Paul has shalom. Many of you will perhaps know the story of Corrie ten Boom and her sister Betsy, who were imprisoned in a concentration camp during the Second World War, and in their cell, in this kind of extreme cramped confinement, Corrie ten Boom describes this knowing joy and thanksgiving. So she learned somehow this shalom. Many of our brothers and sisters in the persecuted church, they know shalom, they know this peace. And the question for us really is, do we know it? So I was reminded this morning of the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul. Tom, earlier on in the week, he posted a little a YouTube video of, like, I think it's the Bethel version of this song, like the updated version, which is also really, really good. But the original version, It Is Well With My Soul, is quite an old-fashioned hymn. And as I was praying this morning, I was reminded of the story behind that hymn. So it was written by this guy called Horatio G. Spafford. And he's, I think he's a lawyer. So he's got quite a lot of money, but then he loses a lot of his finances. And he wants to kind of spend some time with his family. So he sends his wife and his 4 daughters overseas, intending to then follow them. But while his wife and his 4 daughters are traveling overseas, their ship hits another ship and it sinks. And he receives I guess it would have been a telegram from his wife saying, saved alone. So his 4 daughters die in this kind of horrific tragedy. And apparently Horatio Spafford wrote this song after having received that news, whilst he was then on the ship to go and meet his wife. And it really changes the meaning of the words when you know that the person who wrote this is not enjoying life, is in a place of devastation and grief. And yet this is what he says. He says, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Now I just can't imagine being able to write those words. I've got 2 daughters and I just cannot really comprehend being able to write that, knowing that that the people most dear to me have been lost. But somehow Spafford does write it, and he has this shalom. Like Paul, there is something of the secret of contentment. His soul, like the inmost part of him, is well, even in tragedy. And so how are our souls doing today? Spafford's soul is well within him because he has peace with God. And that is the reality of life as a follower of Jesus. Our wellness has nothing to do with our circumstance. Our wellness has nothing even to do with our physical health. Our wellness is because we know God. We have a relationship with him, and our souls have been restored to a relationship with him through Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection. Wellness is completely independent of what is going on in the world around us. In this part of his letter, Paul says, I think, 2 really important things. The first is that this is a learning curve. Spafford, too, he writes that God taught him to say. It wasn't automatic. He had to learn it. And the second thing that Paul writes is that contentment, this wellness, this shalom, is imparted to us from God. We don't muster it up. We can't cover up our grief with plasters and pretend we're fine. Paul says, I can do all this through him who strengthens me. Corrie ten Boom did not thank God for the fleas in her dormitory, like her cell, the place where her and her sister were forced to be in the concentration camp out of her own strength. And Horatio Spafford did not write that hymn out of his own resource, because that's impossible. But shalom comes from the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit at work in us. In another letter, Paul writes this: I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have the power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. So that's from Ephesians chapter 2. And so that's my prayer for us today, as a church, as a community, as people trying to follow Jesus, that we would be filled to the measure with all the fullness of God, that we would know the secret of being content in all circumstances, that we would have shalom. Thanks for listening. I'm not going to post anything tomorrow because Saturday's the day when our family Sabbath, and then on Sunday we've got lots going on Facebook for you to engage with. So yeah, Christchurch Daily will be back on Monday. Have a nice weekend.